The last thing my brother said before he drove away wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a goodbye. It was a dare. $20 says she calls within the hour. He said it loud enough for everyone in the car to hear, and they all laughed. My mother, my stepfather, my sister-in-law, laughing the way people do when something is funny, only because it isn't happening to them. I was standing outside the Greyhound station in Knoxville, Tennessee, wearing the same clothes I'd had on since that morning, holding nothing except my purse, which I would discover 30 seconds later no longer had my wallet in it. My phone was on the back seat of my brother's Tahoe. I had set it down to help carry bags inside when we stopped for gas an hour earlier, and no one mentioned it. Not once. The realization didn't hit me all at once. It crept in the way cold does when you've been standing in it too long, and then suddenly your whole body knows. I was 31 years old. I had a master's degree in education. I had a job, an apartment, a life I had built quietly and carefully over years of being told I wasn't capable of building anything at all. And I was standing outside a bus station in a city I didn't know, with no phone, no money, and the distant sound of my family's laughter still ringing somewhere behind my sternum. What they called it, later, was a prank, a joke, something to loosen me up, my mother said. She always believed I was too serious, too uptight, too afraid of the kind of spontaneity that she mistook for living. But I had learned something about my family's version of spontaneity by then. It always seemed to happen at my expense. And it always seemed to require an audience. I didn't know yet how far I'd have to walk before I understood what that afternoon was really about. I only knew that my brother's taillights had disappeared into traffic, and I was alone in a way I had never been in my adult life, and the sky above Knoxville was turning the color of bruises. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk for a long time, trying to make sense of the situation before accepting it. The station was behind me, busy with strangers pulling luggage, checking phones, living their ordinary lives. I thought about going inside, asking someone if I could borrow their phone. But something stopped me. Maybe pride. Maybe something older than pride. The voice in my head that sounded like my mother's and said, "If you ask for help, you've already lost." I started walking. I didn't have a direction. I just knew that standing still felt like agreeing with them. The street I ended up on was wide and unfamiliar, flanked by gas stations and fast food restaurants, and a pawn shop with a handwritten sign in the window. Afternoon traffic moved in both directions without concern for me. I passed a woman walking a dog who didn't look up. I passed two teenagers sitting on a bus bench scrolling their phones, and I thought about asking them to let me make a call, but I kept going. I don't know why exactly. I think I needed to feel like I was doing something, even if doing something just meant putting one foot in front of the other until the situation changed. I had been the punchline before. Growing up in our house, I understood this the way you understand weather. It was just something that happened, and you adjusted. My brother had always been the funny one. My mother always called him spirited. He had a talent for finding the cracks in a situation and wedging humor into them, and more often than not, the crack ran right through me. When I was 14, he convinced me that my school's dress code had changed the week I'd spent every allowance I'd saved on a new outfit I was excited about. When I was 17, he told our extended family at Thanksgiving that I'd failed my driver's test 3 times. I had failed it once, and everyone laughed while I sat there. When I was 23, he announced at Christmas that I'd been let go from a job I'd actually quit. My mother had smiled and said, "She doesn't handle things well." That was the version of me they believed in. Fragile, dependent, unable to handle things. What I had never told them was that I handled things every single day. I handled my students, my classroom, my lease, my anxiety, my loneliness in a new city, and the quiet grief of a family that didn't see me. I handled things the way women learn to handle things when no one around them believes they can, invisibly alone, without credit. But standing on a street in Knoxville with no phone and no wallet, I wasn't thinking about any of that yet. I was thinking about water. My mouth was dry, and the afternoon heat was sitting on my shoulders like something physical, and I had maybe 4 hours of daylight left and no plan. A truck idling at a red light had its window down, and the driver, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and a Dollywood lanyard hanging from her rearview mirror, looked over and noticed me. I don't know what she saw. Whatever it was, it made her pull to the curb after the light changed. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way people look at you when they know you're lying, but don't want to embarrass you by saying so. Then she asked where I was trying to get to. I told her I wasn't sure yet. She handed me a $20 bill and a granola bar from the center console without asking any more questions. I tried to refuse. She shook her head and said, "I've been where you are, honey. Not exactly, but close enough. Then she drove away before I could even ask her name. I stood on the curb holding the 20 and the granola bar, and something about the anonymity of it. The fact that a complete stranger had seen me more clearly in 30 seconds than my family had, in 31 years, made my eyes sting in a way I hadn't expected. I found a diner 2 blocks away. It was the kind of place with vinyl booths and laminated menus and a pie case rotating slowly by the register. I sat in a corner booth near the window and ordered a cup of coffee and a grilled cheese with what felt like tremendous effort. The waitress, who wore a name tag that said Gwen, and moved like someone who had been on her feet since before sunrise, set a glass of water in front of me without being asked. I wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and looked out at the street. A bus went by. A man walked a stroller. Somewhere across town, my brother was probably laughing about this. My mother was probably agreeing with whatever version of events made her feel least responsible. My stepfather, the way he always did, was probably saying nothing. Just watching, one hand on his knee, letting it all happen around him. Gwen came back to refill my coffee. She paused. "No," I said. "Just trying to figure out my next move." She nodded slowly. She pulled a pen from her apron pocket, wrote something on a napkin and slid it across the table. It was the address of a women's resource center 3 blocks away. "They'll let you use the phone," she said. "And they don't ask too many questions." She didn't ask me what happened. She just gave me what I needed to take the next step. That simple act of attention, of seeing that I needed something specific, and providing it without ceremony, was so different from everything I was used to at home that I had to look away for a moment. I sat with my coffee and let the memory I'd been avoiding come back. 6 months earlier, at my stepfather's birthday dinner, I had arrived late because of traffic. I had called ahead, explained, apologized. By the time I got there, they had eaten without me. My mother said, "We can't always wait for you to get it together." My brother said the traffic story was probably an excuse. My sister-in-law laughed. I sat at the table and picked at the cold leftovers they'd saved, and I smiled. And I told myself they didn't mean it the way it sounded. I had spent my entire life translating my family's cruelty into things they didn't mean. It was exhausting work, and I had done it so long it felt like breathing. The resource center was staffed by a woman named no one I recognized, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She let me use the desk phone and didn't hover. I thought about who to call. My friends from home were people I'd grown careful around. I'd never told them the full truth about my family, the way you protect a wound by not showing it to anyone who might accidentally press on it. But there was one person I trusted completely. My college roommate, who now lived in Nashville and who had always had a way of making crises feel temporarily survivable. I dialed from memory and she picked up on the second ring. "Okay," she said after I explained, "just, okay. No drama, no excessive sympathy." She had always been efficient in emergencies. "I can be in Knoxville in 3 hours. Stay where you are." She made me promise to find somewhere safe to wait. I thanked the woman at the center, who handed me a bus pass and a list of resources as I left, and I went back to the diner. Gwen had saved my booth. I sat there for 2 hours with nothing to do except think, which turned out to be more than I'd done in a long time. Not the anxious hamster wheel kind of thinking I'd grown used to, but something slower. Something that started to feel like clarity. I thought about the trip I'd agreed to join. My brother had called it a family weekend. A chance to reconnect, he'd said. My mother had gotten on the phone and said it would mean a lot to her if I came. This was the language they used when they wanted something. Suddenly my presence meant a lot. Suddenly I was valued. Suddenly we were a family that did things together. And I had said yes because I always said yes to that language. Because somewhere in me, there was still a version of myself that believed the next time would be different. I should have known something was off when my mother offered to drive my car back separately, in case I wanted to sleep on the way. I'd handed over my keys without thinking. My car was already in their driveway in Chattanooga. My wallet had been in my purse. My phone had been in my hand until it wasn't. How much of this had been arranged, I couldn't be certain. But I was starting to understand that certainty wasn't required. The pattern was enough. My stepfather had stood by the car when they left. He hadn't laughed the way my brother had. He never did, but he had gotten in the car. He had driven away. Silence was its own kind of participation, and I had been pretending otherwise my entire life. I thought about the last real conversation I'd had with my grandmother before she passed, when I was 26. She had taken my hand at her kitchen table and said, "You give them too much, baby. You give them the good parts of you and they spend it like they earned it." I had cried and she had held on. She was the only one in that family who talked to me like I was a real person with a full interior life. When she died, I thought I would lose my only tether to the idea that my family was capable of love. And maybe I had. My roommate arrived just after 9. She drove a blue sedan with a bumper sticker that said "Never tell us," and she hugged me in the diner parking lot for a long time without saying anything. In the car, she asked if I wanted to talk about it. I said I wanted to think first. She turned on a low playlist and drove. I watched Tennessee pass by in the dark, and tried to sort through what had become clear during those hours in the diner booth. Not all of it was new. Some of it I had known for years, in the way you know something is wrong with a tooth. You feel it, you compensate for it, you do not press directly on it, because you know what that will feel like. But clarity is different from knowledge. Clarity is what happens when you stop compensating. My mother had built her relationship with me on the premise that I was the child who needed the most managing. She had offered this as love. She called me sensitive when I objected to how I was treated. She called me dramatic when I needed my experiences taken seriously. She called me fragile in front of others, and then seemed confused when I didn't push back, not understanding or not caring that when you tell a child she is fragile long enough, she starts to believe it. My brother had taken the shape of her belief and turned it into entertainment. My sister-in-law had joined in, because it was easier to laugh with the family than to ask questions. My stepfather had let it happen because it didn't happen to him. And I had let all of it happen because I was waiting for them to become the family I needed them to be. My roommate put me up in her guest room, which had clean sheets and a noise machine and a small lamp that cast the kind of warm light that makes a room feel like a held breath. I couldn't sleep at first. I lay there in the dark and listened to the sounds of her apartment building. A door closing somewhere, a car on the street, the creak of the hallway floor, and I thought about the version of myself that had gotten into their car that morning. That version of me had believed on some level that she owed them the benefit of the doubt. That family meant something beyond behavior. That people who were supposed to love you eventually would, if you stayed patient enough, if you gave enough, if you made yourself small enough not to take up space they needed for their contempt. I was done being patient. I called in for a substitute the next morning and borrowed my roommate's laptop. I spent 3 hours finding every document, every account, every piece of my life that had my mother's name or address on it. Utilities, I had listed her as emergency contact because she'd asked me to. A bank account I'd had since college that still showed my childhood address. A medical record profile I'd never updated. I changed them, one by one, until the only proof of her existence in my administrative life was my own memory. My roommate made coffee and didn't ask what I was doing. She had always understood that there were kinds of work that required silence to complete. On the second evening, I called my mother. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. She launched in before I could say anything. They'd been so worried. It was just a bit of fun. She didn't think I'd take it so seriously. My brother felt terrible. I listened to all of it. I let it run out the way water runs out of a faucet when you leave it long enough. Then I spoke. "You planned it," I said. "More than once, I think, and everyone went along with it." She started to explain again. I didn't raise my voice. I had spent so many years being told I was too emotional that I had become very precise when it mattered most. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm done. There's a difference." She said I was overreacting. She said my brother had already apologized in a text, which I hadn't received, obviously, since they'd left me without my phone. She said I needed to think about what it would mean for the family if I made this into something bigger than it was. "I'm not going to make it into anything," I told her. "I'm just not going to be in it anymore." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard in a long time. Not shocked silence, recognition silence, the kind of quiet that happens when someone finally says the thing that has always been true, and no one in the room can pretend otherwise. I drove back to Chattanooga 2 days later to get my car. My roommate offered to come. I told her I needed to do this one alone. My mother's house looked the same from the driveway. The same flower beds she'd never let me help with. The same wind chimes on the porch that had always seemed too cheerful for the house they lived on. I had a key. I used it. I walked through the kitchen, where every surface had its peculiar smell of dish soap and old wood, and the brand of air freshener she'd used my entire life, and I felt nothing I hadn't already felt before, which was its own kind of answer. My car was in the driveway with a full tank of gas. My mother had filled it up, which surprised me, and then did not surprise me, because she always did the small things. The small things were never the problem. The small things were what made the larger things so confusing for so long. I left my key on the kitchen counter. I didn't write a note. I was almost at my car when my brother came out the side door. He looked older than I'd seen him last, or maybe I was looking at him differently. He started to talk. He said he hadn't meant for it to go that far. He said it was supposed to be funny. He said I'd always been too serious about things like this. I listened until he finished. Then I said, the problem was never that I was too serious. The problem was that no one in this house has ever stopped laughing long enough to notice. I got in my car and drove north. The interstate opened up past the city limits, long and wide and ordinary, and I let myself settle into the drive in a way I hadn't been able to settle into anything in a long time. I had a full tank of gas and a clear road and a playlist I'd made on my roommate's phone before I left, and somewhere behind me was a house full of people who had decided, long before that day in Knoxville, what kind of person I was going to be. They had been wrong. A few weeks after I got home, I ran into a colleague in the teacher's lounge who had grown up in a family that sounded, when she described it in general terms over coffee, like mine. She said something I've thought about nearly every day since. She said, the hardest part isn't leaving. The hardest part is accepting that leaving is enough. She said she'd spent years after cutting off her family waiting for some kind of proof that she'd been right to go. Some sign that the leaving had meant something. And eventually she realized that the only proof she needed was the life she was building in the space they used to fill. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about how much of my energy had gone into interpreting my family's behavior, managing their feelings about my reactions, and adjusting myself to avoid the edges of their cruelty. I thought about what it might mean to spend that energy on something else entirely. My apartment felt different when I came home after everything, not bigger, exactly. Just mine in a way it hadn't felt before. I made dinner from scratch for the first time in months, something my grandmother used to make, and I ate it slowly, and I didn't explain it to anyone or justify the portion size or brace for a comment that never came. I sat with the quiet and I let it be quiet. I haven't spoken to my mother since that phone call. My brother sent 2 texts that I read and did not answer. My sister-in-law sent a long message that I closed without finishing. My stepfather sent nothing, which was the most honest thing any of them did. I don't know what version of me they're waiting for. The one who apologizes, the one who explains herself into exhaustion, the one who decides that being part of the family is worth whatever it costs. That version isn't coming back. What I know now, that I didn't know standing outside that bus station with no wallet and no phone and the sound of their laughter still in my chest, is that I was never what they told me I was. I was exactly what they needed me to believe I wasn't, capable, clear-eyed, and completely fine on my own. They had spent years building a version of me that required them to exist, and when they left me with nothing to prove it, I proved something else instead. I proved that I didn't need them to survive. I never had. What stays is that. What goes is everything I carried for them, that was never mine to carry in the first place.